Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. Unfortunately, last night I experienced some technical difficulties. The internet was not working properly, so I was not able to post the share. So I am now going to post a double share. I'm trying to cover yesterday's material and today's material. So we're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey, and we will be learning today Daf Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph and Daf Kuf Yud Ches Amud Beis. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Yom Tov, and we are doing Siman Tov Kuf Dalid. We pick up on the bottom line of Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis in the midst of Sif Aleph, and hopefully by the end of the shir, we will conclude Siman Tov Kuf Dalid. So we have been discussing the malacha of Toichen on Yom Tov. And in the beginning of Sif Aleph, the Mechaber told us that we're allowed to grind spices for Yom Tov use. Now, we had mentioned earlier that grinding is a malacha, which is generally speaking aser on Yom Tov, even l'tzarech ochel nefesh. And we said that the basic reason for that is that toichen is a malacha that was generally done where you did a lot of it at one time. You don't grind a little flour when you need to make a cake. You don't grind 2.5 cups of flour for your cake. Generally speaking, grinding is an operation. You take a lot of wheat and you grind flour for 6 months. So it's generally not seen as a malacha that's done with tzorech hayom. It's not done for the purposes of one day. Therefore, if you engage on toichen on Yom Tov, it looks like you're doing something which is not only l'tzarech ochel nefesh for Yom Tov. You're engaging in what's called an avodah rabbah. You're doing something which is generally done for long-term purposes, and where you do a lot of it at one time. And that's not something that we're matir on Yom Tov. And we've spoken out previously that there are possibly other reasons as well. Some hold that Toichen on Yom Tov is actually an Issa D'Oraisa, and the Torah was never matir Toichen. Others say it's the Rabbanan. That's all material that we already covered. However, the Mechaber told us in Sif Aleph that you are allowed to grind spices for Yom Tov use, because spices are something which, if you grind them before Yom Tov, either their taste will become weak by the time you need them on Yom Tov, or according to others, the taste of the spices will actually become ruined on Yom Tov. And grinding of spices is something that was, generally speaking, done l'tzarech hayom. They were not in the practice of grinding large quantities of spices at once, and therefore the Chachamim felt that this is something which is mutter on Yom Tov, and therefore the Mechaber said over here, you can grind spices in the typical manner. You don't even have to make a shinui. Then the Mechaber told us that this stands in contrast to salt. If you have clumps of salt that require grinding, those you're allowed to grind them on Yom Tov, but only with a shinui. Why? Because salt is something which is not mefig taimam. The taste of the salt will not fade or become bitter if you grind it before Yom Tov, and therefore, really, you should have ground it before Yom Tov. And also, like the Mefarshim say, there's no such thing as you didn't know you were going to need salt. Every dish requires salt. People add salt to everything. Even chocolate chip cookies have salt in them, and you should know if you leave out that little bit of salt that goes into chocolate chip cookies, you'll taste the cookie and you'll say right away something is missing. Somehow the salt brings out all of the other tastes. So since every dish needs salt, you knew already before Yom Tov you're going to need salt, and there's no cost to Yom Tov by grinding the salt earlier. So really, you should have ground it before Yom Tov. If you didn't grind it before Yom Tov, then the Mechaber says you could grind it on Yom Tov, but you have to do it with a shinui. You have to do it in a little bit of a different way. And the the Mishnah Berurah wrote here, right? You have to make a shinui. The Mechaber said that either you tilt the mortar and the pestle, or you grind it onto a plate, not in a mortar. So you have to make some kind of shinui. Now we find ourselves on the bottom line of Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, and we continue in the words of the Mechaber. The Mechaber says, however, even though you're allowed to grind spices on Yom Tov, ve'ein sheichikin es ha'pilpulin v'lo es ha'chardol b'rechaim shelahem. You are not permitted to grind pepper or mustard seed in the mill that was typically used for them. So they had some kind of pepper mill, some kind of mustard mill, which was a tool that was specifically used for the grinding of pepper and mustard, and that the Mechaber says you are not allowed to use on Yom Tov. And the Mechaber continues and explains why. He says, Mishum dehevi ku'uvdin dechol, because using that, grinding the pepper or the mustard seed in that way, that would be an uvda dechol. That would be engaging in a weekday activity that would not be covered Yom Tov. And let's take a look in the Mishnah Berurah is cut and test. The Mishnah Berurah says, Mishum dehevi ku'uvdin dechol. This is a few lines down on Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Mishum dehevi ku'uvdin dechol tfei. If you use the pepper mill or you use the special grinder for the mustard seed, that is very much a uvda dechol, because you're using a specialized tool. And the Mefarshim also say that when they did grind pepper or mustard seed using this kind of mill or this kind of tool, then they usually did do an avodah rabbah. They usually did do it in large quantities. And therefore, this is something which is not permitted on Yom Tov. The Chavetz Chaim continues and he brings down another reason as well. V'yesha kasvu, there are those that write, and in the Sharet Zion, he brings this down here from the Rashba, and the Berurah Halacha discusses this at great length. If you're interested, you can take a look over there in the Berurah Halacha. V'yesha kasvu, mishun dehevi al yedei zeh toichin gomor. Somehow, by using the traditional pepper mill or the mustard seed mill, now it's toichin gomor. It really looks like you're engaging in a full-scale toichen operation to aser b'Yom Tov l'kulei alma. And as we said earlier, toichen is definitely aser on Yom Tov according to everyone. Ukedele'el b'siman tav tzadikei sif beis. So exactly what the two different reasons that the Chavetz Chaim are discussing here, what's the differences between the two reasons? The Mechaber said that you can't use the pepper mill because it's uvda dechol. Somehow when you're using a specialized tool in order to do this grinding, that looks like a weekday activity. So it's not aser because of toichen. That's not the isser. The isser is not toichen. The isser is uvda dechol. The same way riding a bike that would be suitable to ride to work is aser on Shabbos and on Yom Tov because it's uvda dechol. It looks like you're engaging in weekday practices, and that's something which is a zilzal Shabbos, a zilzal Yom Tov. So too over here, when you sit down to use a specialized tool, a specialized pepper mill, a specialized mustard seed mill, that's an uvda dechol. So that isser has nothing to do really with the isser of toichen. It's an isser, separate isser of uvda dechol. The second reason that the Chavetz Chaim is bringing down from the Rashba would seem to be that somehow, like we said, toichen really meyikar adin is aser. We're mater the toichen in the case of the spices because it's not something that was an avodah rabbah. It's something that was typically done as a small scale thing. You ground a teaspoon of spices to add to your dish. So that's not the toichen that's aser on Yom Tov. But to use a pepper mill, that already becomes a higher level of toichen. Now we're going to aser it because of toichen. We're not asering it because of the dechol. We're asering it because of toichen. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, right by the ice cut in Yud Daled for the Sharet Zion. Mishnah Berurah says, "Va'afilu writes alasai shinui." Even if you want to use the pepper mill or the mustard mill, and you want to use it in an atypical manner, you want to make a shinui. Kigain, for example, litchain chada chada. Instead of throwing in a bunch of pepper seeds and grinding them all at once, you're going to throw in one pepper seed and grind it, and then throw in another pepper seed and grind it. So you're certainly making a shinui. Ukahai gavna, or you make some other kind of shinui in the grinding process. Nami aser b'reichayim. This is still forbidden if you're employing a pepper mill because you still have these problems either of uvda dechol or because of toichen gomer. V'hu adin, and similarly the same halacha applies litchain coffee, litchain kaveh b'reichayim shalahen. If you want to grind coffee in a coffee grinder, says the Chavetz Chaim, nami aser. That is also aser. And again, it could be that that's uvda dechol. To use go into the kitchen and take out your coffee grinder, that looks like a weekday activity. That's a zilzal Yom Tov. Ella rather, if you have to grind up your coffee beans, yichtaish b'machteshes, you should do it in a mortar and pestle. Va'ayin bir halacha, and he sends you to the bir halacha dibur amaschil ve'ein shoichikin. That's this lengthy bir halacha here on Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, who discusses the various reasons why these types of teichen are osir on Yom Tov, and he also throws out the possibility of different kinds of coffee grinders, which might be mutter. Could be if you have a coffee grinder that only does a very small amount at one time. He throws out, there are some shittas that hold that would be mutter, but over here in the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim was machriya, and he says you're not allowed to use a coffee grinder on Yom Tov. Okay. Now we go back up to the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said you're not allowed to grind the pepper or the mustard seed in their specialized tools. Ella, continues the Mechaber in the middle of the top line of Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, Ella rather dachaysam b'meducha kechal hatfalin. If you do have to grind up pepper or mustard seed, you should use a mortar and pestle like you do with all other types of spices, and that would be mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Yud, Ella dachaysam. Rather, you should crush them in a mortar and pestle. Miu, however, tzarich lizayer shelo yadachaysam ela masha tzarich liyom hazeh. Chavetz Chaim does point out, even though it's mutter to grind up the pepper or the mustard seed in a mortar and pestle, because you don't have the uvda dechel problem, you're not using a specialized tool, and you don't have the teichen gomer problem because you're not doing a full-scale teichen operation here. You're using a mortar and pestle. However, remember, you're still only allowed to do it what's for tzarech hayom, what you need for today. You wouldn't even be allowed to crush up a larger amount of pepper so you should have for the second day of Yom Tov. You're only allowed to do what you need right now for Yom Tov Rishon. Now we go to the words of the Ramah. The Ramah says, Hagah. Umihu, nevertheless, noyhagin lishanois ktsas bedichas tvolin. Even though the Mechaber said that you're allowed to grind spices on Yom Tov in the normal fashion, you could do it even without a shinui in a mortar and pestle. Nevertheless, says the Ramah, our minig is that we do make some kind of shinui when we grind up the spices, even though we're doing it in a mortar, we're using a mortar and pestle, and we said it's mutter. Nevertheless, the Ramah says we do it with a shinui. He brings this down from the Hagos Maimoni in the name of the Smak, and he ends off the Sif by saying v'chein roi lahoros, and that is how a Rav should paskin, that if you're grinding spices on Yom Tov, it should be done with a shinui. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cotton Yud Aleph. Umihu again, nevertheless, the custom is that we grind spices with a shinui. Hatam, the reason for this is, says the Chavetz Chaim, mishum diyesh paiskin hamachmirin, because there are those paiskim that rule stringently, and he brings this down from the Gra, va'imrim, and they say, tegam bitfalin hamafigin tam, that even in regard to spices, where if you would have ground it on Erev Yom Tov, the taste of the spices would become weak or would become ruined. Still in all, ein mutar l'duchan b'Yom Tov kedarkan, you're still not allowed to grind it on Yom Tov in the normal fashion. Ella in kain lo yada me'esmal sheyitztarech lehem b'Yom Tov, unless you had no idea on Erev Yom Tov that you were going to require the spices. So the Gra is saying the only time you're allowed to grind spices on Yom Tov without a shinui is if something came up on Yom Tov, suddenly you found out that you need to cook on Yom Tov and you had no idea on Erev Yom Tov that you were going to need spices. So now, not only is there a cost to Yom Tov if you would have ground them on Erev Yom Tov because the taste would be weak or would be ruined, you couldn't have done it on Erev Yom Tov because on Erev Yom Tov you had no idea that you were going to need it. So then it would be mutter to do it without a shinui. That's the chumrah of the Gra. And the Chavetz Chaim says that this Ramah is telling you that lechatchila we concern ourselves with this shita of the Gra, and therefore, if you want to grind spices on Yom Tov, you always have to use a shinu. Miu, however, even those machmirim only take the more stringent position when it comes to something like spices. Aval bishum, but when it comes to garlic, we're talking about fresh garlic, ubatzel or onion, v'shachalayim or cress. So these are fresh vegetables. These you certainly cannot grind or crush on Erev Yom Tov. Even if you knew on Erev Yom Tov that you're going to need them tomorrow, because these kinds of vegetables would be ruined completely if you ground them up before Yom Tov. So certainly this stringency, this chumrah, would not apply to shum, ubitzalim, and kres, and shachalayim. V'yesha kasvu, and there are those that write, and the Sharetzian, he brings this down in the name of the Achronim, and he says, take a look at the Gra, the Lafia Minig, that according to our custom, ein chilik, we do not differentiate ben yodam yesmail, between a case where you knew on Erev Yom Tov that you were going to require the spices, lelo yoda, or even if you did not know that you were going to need them. Ubechol gavni ein nayagim loduch b'Yom Tov. In neither case are we accustomed to grinding on Yom Tov without a shinoi, ela im kein al yedei eze shinoi, only if we apply some kind of a shinoi. So here you have it. So in the beginning of the Mishnah Berurah here, he brought down the Gra, and the Gra said that we're machmir on the grinding of spices, and we require a shinoi unless you had no idea on Erev Yom Tov that you were going to need the spices. And then later he says that we extend that even to a case where you didn't know. Even if you didn't know on Erev Yom Tov that you were going to need the spices, still you're not allowed to grind the spices without employing a shinoi. And he concludes Ois Kat Yud Aleph by saying the reason we're machmer is shemitoich kach, because by being machmer and requiring the employee of a shinoi, yi ha'am zechurim, everybody will remember she'asar laduch, that there is a prohibition involved in grinding up things and even spices, rak ma shetzarich la'osei hayom, that you're only allowed to do what you need for that day. So basically, it sounds like what the Chavetz Chaim is saying here is that we're machmir, and one of the reasons we're so machmir is because if we're going to allow people to grind up spices without any shinoi whatsoever, they're going to completely forget that there's any isser involved in the grinding up of spices at all. And then what will happen? They'll grind up spices on Yom Tov, even for what they need for tomorrow, even if what they need for next week. They're going to look at the pepper shaker, they're going to see the pepper shaker is empty. Oh, let me grind more pepper. There's no isser involved in grinding pepper. And they'll grind up a half a container of pepper that they certainly don't need for Yom Tov. So in order to be careful and to make sure that doesn't happen, we say that you can't grind it unless you use a shinoi. Now we'll know that there's an isser involved, even in the grinding of the spices. So certainly I can only do what I need, l'tzarech hayom. Now continues the Mechaber in Sif Beis. Mutter laholich tfalin umadoich eitzel meducha. You are allowed to transport spices, and you're allowed to transport the pestle. That's the tool that you use to do the crushing. Eitzel madoicha, to the mortar. So you have the mortar in one location, you have the pestle and the spices in another location. You're allowed to transport the pestle, and you're allowed to transport the spices to the location of the mortar. Ay maducha etzlam. Or you could also bring the mortar to the location of the pestle and the spices. Afilu derek rishus harabim. And this is true even if you're going to go through rishus harabim. So you're going to be performing the malacha of haitzah. Now the malacha of haitzah is mutter on Yom Tov if you're doing it l'tzarech. Therefore the Mechaber says, if you have a mortar in one location and spices and a pestle in another location, you should know you're allowed to do the malacha of haitzah in order to bring the spices and the pestle to the location of the mortar, or vice versa. And this is true, even though theoretically you could have done this on Erev Yom Tov. On Erev Yom Tov, you could have made sure that everything was in the same location. Nevertheless, you're allowed to do it on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kat Yud Beis. You're allowed to bring the pestle. Madoich hainu habuchna. The madoich is the buchna, which is the pestle. That's the piece that you shove into the mortar. The mortar is the container. The pestle is the tool that you use to crush the ingredients inside the mortar. Another name for the pestle is a buchna. Shamakin bay b'sayich hamaducha. That's what you use to strike the ingredients that are inside the mortar. You're allowed to transport these items even by way of Rishus Harabim. Now what's the novelty over here? So the Chavetz Chaim explains. You would ask, there's no novelty here. You're doing Haitzah l'tzarech. We know that Hitzal Tzarech on Yom Tov is mutter. So what's the Chiddush? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, V'lo Chayshinan. We do not concern ourselves. Dimla Mimlach V'lo Yoduch. Maybe you'll change your mind. Maybe you'll bring the pestle and the spices to the location of the mortar in your cousin's house down the block. So you transported these items through the Rishus HaRabim. Now you're going to come to your cousin's house, and your cousin is going to say, oh, what, you're cooking? You don't have to cook. I have plenty of food over here. Join us for the Suda. And now you're all going to go to your cousin for the Suda, and now you're never going to grind the spices. So it turns out that you transported items through the Rishus HaRabim shaloi l'tzarech at all, because you never ended up doing it. So therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, that's the Chiddush. V'lo chayshinan, we're not concerned. Dilma mimlach, maybe you'll change your mind. V'lo yaduch, and you'll never do the grinding. V'nimtza, and it'll come out shahaitzi shaloi l'tzarech, that you performed the malacha of haitzah shaloi l'tzarech. We're not concerned for that. Uchidaleil Siman Tav Tzadik Ches Siv Beis Ayin Sham. Now we go to Siv Gimel. Says the Mechaber. Ein kaichin harifais b'machteshes gedola. You're not allowed to crush grain into grits in a large machteshes, in a large grinding implement. Aval kaichin b'machteshes ketana. However, you are allowed to do this sort of grinding in a small grinding implement. Shezehu hashinui shalah. Because using the small machteshes as opposed to the large machteshes, that constitutes a shinui in regard to this mitzias. In regard to this type of grinding, using a machteshes ketana instead of a gedola constitutes a shinui. What's at play over here? Says the Mishnah Berurah cutting your dal. Ein kaichin harifais. You're not allowed to grind grain into grits. Shezehu kamay techina gemura sha'asa b'Yom Tov. Because the Mishnah Berurah says, using a machteshes gedola, using a large grinder to grind grain into grits, say that 10 times fast, grind grain into grits, that would be techina gemura. That is a full-scale grinding operation. It's something which was usually done it's an avodah rabbah. You ground a lot at one time. That's why you are using a machteshes gedola. So this looks like the teichen of an avodah rabbah, which is aser even on Yom Tov. Ukamay pilpulin berechaim shalahem. And this is similar to the second reason that the Chavetz Chaim said above in Ice Cut and Test, why it's not mutter to grind pepper and mustard seed on Yom Tov, because it's teichen gemura. And it could be, I assume, according to the other reason, this also looks like an uvdu dechayel, because again, you're using a specialized tool. You're using the machteshes gedola that's made specifically for this kind of operation. V'im kitesh. Now, if you transgressed this halacha and you did grind the rifais, you did grind the grain into grits, then mashma b'gemara, the Gemara in Bein Yudalet Amud Beis is mashma. It implies she'asar lechal mizeh, that it would actually be asr, would be forbidden to use these grits on Yom Tov. Ais cotton tezvav, you could use the machteshes ketana. Why? Shezeh shinui shalah, because using the machteshes ketana instead of the gedola, that constitutes a shinui. The b'chayil ein derech lichtaish b'ketana, because during the week they would not use the ketana. Mipnei she'ein nichtash dak hetev. Apparently, the machteshes ketana the gedola did a better job of grinding up the grits into finer pieces, and the ketana didn't grind it as fine. So during the week, even if you only wanted to produce a small amount of grits, you would use the gedola because it grinds it more fine. So using a ketana, that's already a shinui. Now we go to a very interesting cryptic phrase of the Mechaber. Let's go back to the Mechaber. The last word on Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, the Mechaber says, "Ube Eretz Yisrael." In Eretz Yisrael, afilu beketana aser. In Eretz Yisrael, you are forbidden to grind the grain into grits, even if you use a machteshes ketana. And we'll explain why. The Mishnah Berurah is going to give 3 different reasons for this. But first, let's finish the sentence here in the Mechaber. And the Mechaber rules, nowadays, he says, we don't know specifically what size machteshes constitutes a gedola and what constitutes a ketana, and therefore yesh lesar hakoil. Therefore, the Mechaber says nowadays we would forbid everything. We would forbid the grinding of the grits using any kind of machteshes because we don't know what constitutes a gedola and what constitutes a ketana. Let's turn back to Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph and let's see the Mishnah Berurah is cotton Tez Zayin. Eretz Yisrael. So the Mechaber told us that in Eretz Yisrael, outside of Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, you could use a ketana, in a machteshes ketana. In Eretz Yisrael, you cannot even grind the grits using a machteshes ketana. What's the difference between Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael? So the Mishnah Berurah here in Nice Cotton Tez Zayin is going to give us three different possibilities. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Kama pirushim yesh bazeh. There are many different rationales given for this distinction. Yesh mefarshim. There are those that explain, and this is brought down from Rashi, the Asru be'Eretz Yisrael, that they forbade in Eretz Yisrael even using a machteshes ketana, mishum dahayu regilim lahachzik avodim, because in Eretz Yisrael it was commonplace for the households to have avodim kinanim. They had non-Jewish avodim, umezalzali bazeh, and they were not careful about making this distinction about grinding the grits using specifically a machteshes ketana. They would do it even using a machteshes kedola. Sha'osim kedarkon b'chol. These avodim would grind the grits the same way they always do during the week. And then when their bosses would question them, they would say, no, we used the ketana. Don't worry, we used the ketana. But it was baloney. Really, they were using the gedola. So it came out from this a zilzul Yom Tov. And lefikach, therefore, asru chachamim legamri. Therefore, the chachamim asered the grinding of grain into grits, no matter what kind of machteshes you used, even if you used a ketana. Vimkein. Now, if that's true, if that's the basis for this halacha, then ledina, then the halacha would be bismanenu in our days talui bazeh. Whether or not it's mutter for us to grind grits in the machteshes ketana would be dependent on this question. In locales where people were accustomed to having avodim kenanim, who might be mezalzel in this halacha, asar b'chal gavni, then it would be also for them to grind grits even using a machteshes ketana. But in a locale where they don't have avodim kenanim, then it would be mutter to grind the grits with the machteshes ketana. So that's the first reason. V'yesha kasvu, and there are those that say, and this is brought down for the Rambam, the Be'eretz Yisrael hayu hachitim mishubachim. In Eretz Yisrael, the wheat was a much higher quality. She'ein miskalkalim, and it did not get ruined. V'loy nishtanim arisam, and the appearance of the grain did not change. Im yichtishay me'erev Yom Tov, if you would grind them on erev Yom Tov. So basically, the Rambam is saying that in Eretz Yisrael, the grain was of such high quality that if you would grind them on erev Yom Tov, there would be no cost to Yom Tov. So why are you grinding it on Yom Tov? We're not going to be matter you to do it on Yom Tov if you could have done on erev Yom Tov without any cost to Yom Tov. So therefore, in Eretz Yisrael, where they had higher quality grain, it was aser. And for that reason, the Chazal will not matter the grinding of grits on Yom Tov, even using a machteshes ketana, because you should have done it on erev Yom Tov. And if that's true, then that in any locale where they have high quality wheat, which won't get ruined if it's ground before Yom Tov, aser, that it's also to do it on Yom Tov, even in a machteshes ketana. So that's the second reason. Now comes the third reason. V'yesha kasvu, and there are those that write, and this is brought from the Ravid and the Rashba. V'yesha kasvu, de bebavel hayu regilim lechol tadir daisa. In Bavel, it was very commonplace, a staple, a food staple in Bavel, outside of Eretz Yisrael, was daisa, which is like a porridge, a cereal that's made out of these grits. So since in Bavel, outside of Eretz Yisrael, they needed a tremendous amount of grits because it was mamish a staple by them, like kachu b'machteshes ketanos. So they never produced the grits using a machteshes ketana, because whenever they produced grits, they produced large quantities. And therefore, therefore it stands to reason that on Yom Tov, if you employed a machteshes ketana, heavy shinoi, that constitutes a shinui. Because outside of Eretz Yisrael, they never ground grits using a machteshes ketana. They always produced a large quantity of grits, so they always used the machteshes gedola. So to use a machteshes ketana is a shinui, and therefore it would be mutter. Masha ain't kain Eretz Yisrael, but that stands in contrast to Eretz Yisrael, shalo yahayu regilin harbe bazeh, where daisa, this kind of porridge or cereal, was not a staple. And therefore, they didn't need a large quantity. So then, so then during the week when they decided that they wanted to have daisa and they needed grits, they ground it using a machteshes ketana. So then you're not employing a shinui. If you use a machteshes ketana on Yom Tov, and therefore it would be aser. If that's true, then the Huadin Bizmanenu, then the Chavetz Chaim says, in our days this would also be the case, Tali Gam Kain Bazeh. Whether or not it's mutter to grind grits using a machteshes ketana is also dependent on this question. If it's not the derech, if it's not normal to use a machteshes ketana during a weekday, then shari, then it's mutter to use a machteshes ketana on Yom Tov, because that would constitute a shinui. But if it's normal to use a machteshes ketana during the week, then using machteshes ketana on Yom Tov is not a shinui, and it would be also v'yesh lahachmer kechala pirushim. And the Chavetz Chaim concludes by saying we should follow the chumrah of each one of these reasons. So then it would come out, if you're in a locale where they have avadim kananim, you're not allowed to use even a machteshes ketana because it'll come to zilzal Yom Tov. If you're in a locale that has high quality wheat, so then you could have done the grinding on Erev Yom Tov, and there would be no cost to Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov. And lastly, this last reason, the chumrah would be that if you live in a locale where they don't use a lot of grits, and therefore it's normal to use a machteshes ketana even during the week, then you're not allowed to do it even with a machteshes ketana on Yom Tov, because it does not constitute a shinui. Okay, then the Mechaber said, since we don't know what constitutes a machteshes ketana and what constitutes a machteshes gedola, we answer the grinding of grits using anything. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Berurah is cutting Yud Zayin, became she'ein ein bir halacha. He says to the bir halacha over here that has an interesting tangential point. Now we go to the words of the Ramah. Says the Ramah, Hagah, umuter ligrar gevina b'Yom Tov. You're allowed to, I'm going to use the word grind, but it's not, okay, ligrar, all right, let's say it this way. The word ligrar, I think, literally means to drag or scratch. And it means that you're allowed to grind cheese. Omuta ligrar gvina b'Yom Tov. You're allowed to grind cheese, shred cheese on Yom Tov, al hakli shehu moirig charutz, which is a scratched out grinder. I believe that the metzius, the facts of this kind of grinding tool is they would take a block of wood and then they would cut grooves into the wood. Now, by cutting grooves into the wood, what you're doing is you're creating a surface which is bumpy. You're creating a surface that has peaks and valleys, right? Because you cut grooves. Now, whenever you have that kind of surface, you could use that to abrade something. So imagine you take a block of cheese and you have this block of wood that has this grooved, uneven surface. You could take the cheese and rub it back and forth on this surface, and it will have the effect of grinding up and shredding up the cheese. So that's what the Ramah is telling you here. You're allowed to grind the cheese on this kind of keli, and it seems that you're allowed to do it even without a shinui. No, I'm sorry. You're allowed to do this, but the Ramah continues, miu tzarich shinui ma'at, but you do have to employ a shinui, kemai dichas melach. The same way we said at the beginning of Sif Aleph, that you're allowed to grind spices on Yom Tov in the normal way without a shinui. That was the sheet of the Mechaber. The Ramah said we do use a shinui, but the Mechaber said you don't need a shinui. You could grind it without a shinui, but if you're grinding salt, you need a shinui. Why? Because salt doesn't get spoiled. The taste doesn't go bad if you do it on Erev Yom Tov. So too cheese, says the Rama, you're allowed to grate the cheese, but you have to use a shinoi the same way you would use a shinoi when you were grinding salt. Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here. He's cutting Yuches. On mutter ligrar, you're allowed to shred the cheese using this keli. You should not compare this to the grinding of peppercorns or mustard seed using a pepper mill. Over there, we said you're not allowed to use the pepper mill because that's an ovda d'chayil. That looks like you're engaging in a weekday activity. But you're allowed to shred the cheese using this marug charutz, and that's not a problem. The Berechayim have a uvda d'chayil tfei. The Rechayim, the pepper mill, is a specialized tool, and that really looks like an uvda d'chayil. The marug charetz is not such a specialized tool. So if you're grinding the cheese on the marug charetz, that you're allowed to do, there's no uvda d'chayil problem. So the first thing that the Ramah is telling you here is you're allowed to shred the cheese using the marug charetz, and do not compare it to the grinding of peppercorns or mustard seeds using a pepper mill. Not the same. That is an uvda d'chayil. This is not an uvda d'chayil. Then the Ramah said, you need a shinoi. I was cutting your test. Miutz are a shinoi. However, when you shred the cheese, you have to employ a shinoi. Says the Chavetz Chaim, why? Ta'al pi roiv ein mafik tam. Because he says that the nature of cheese is that normally there's no difference in the taste of the cheese whether you shred it on Erev Yom Tov or you shred it on Yom Tov. So there's no cost to Yom Tov if you shred it on Erev Yom Tov, so you should have shredded it on Erev Yom Tov. You didn't shred it on Erev Yom Tov, all right, you could shred it on Yom Tov, but you have to use a shinu. Umiyu, however, says the Chavetz Chaim, im meifig tam, if the fact is that this cheese, if you would have shredded it before Yom Tov, it wouldn't taste the same. There is a cost to Yom Tov. Then mutter afilu b'loy shinoi min adin. Then min adin you would be allowed to do it even without a shinoi. Ella, however, de leyesh noyagin de le'el b'chol gavni mishani. But let's remember, according to the Ramah in Sif Aleph on the top of Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, even spices that are meifig taimam, even spices where there is a cost to Yom Tov, still we said, the Ramah said you should do a shinui. So here by the cheese also, even if there's going to be a cost to Yom Tov because it's going to be meifik tam, still you should use a shinui. V'tamcha, continues the Mishnah Berurah, v'tamcha, horseradish, shekarin chrein, that we call chrein, af agav shekama pa'amim teichen in atamcha b'shir meruba, even though it's very commonplace that when you grind the chrein, you do it in a larger quantity, l'shtayim or l'shloisha yamim, you grind horseradish for using over the course of 2 or 3 days, so it's an avuda rabba l'chayra. Afal pikein, still in all, yesh l'tzaded v'loymar d'loy gozru chachamim bazeh lesar afilu b'teichen l'yoymai. The Chazal did not answer. There's a good argument to make to say that the Chachamim did not say that it's usher to grind chrein for the purposes of today. Basically, what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here is, how about grinding chrein? Is that a problem of avuda rabbah? It's very commonplace to grind a larger quantity of chrein. So maybe you'll say, okay, anything that you usually grind, you usually do an avuda rabbah, so then maybe that's asur on Yom Tov. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. We only find that they answered palpalim and chardal because over there you use a specialized tool. And by using a specialized tool, that's an uvda d'chayil problem. That's tchina gemura because it's used using a specialized tool. That's the normal fashion of tchina. But over here, where you're just doing horseradish and you're just using a marug charetz, you're not using a specialized tool, and you're only doing it for today. So that there's a good reason to say that the Chazal didn't answer that. Umiu, however, the Chavetz Chaim says, Al kol panim yesh l'shanos k'tzas, you certainly should employ some type of a shinui. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, ukeshetoichen atamcha shaloi al gabe ka'ara, if you grind the horseradish not onto a dish, ela al hamapa, rather you do it directly onto a tablecloth, ayal hashulchan, or directly onto the table, mikri shinui, that would be called a shinui. I know if I want to make chremslach or something on Yom Tov, I want to grind a potato using a rib eisen, I do it directly onto the table and then scoop it up off the table. Mutter lachtach b'Yom Tov yerakos tak tak b'lo shinui. You're allowed to chop up fresh vegetables on Yom Tov into small pieces, and you are not required to use a shinui. So you want to take a red pepper and you wish it tzarich lo'isei hayoim. However, you're only allowed to cut up what you need for today. Continues the Ramah, right by the ois cotton chaf for the Mishnah Berurah. V'hu hadin matzos b'lo shinui. You're also allowed to grind up matzah, and you're allowed to do it without a shinui. Now let's break over there for a moment, and let's go straight to the Mishnah Berurah's cotton chaf. V'hu hadin matzos b'lo shinui. So too, you're allowed to grind up matzahs without a shinui. Now, what's puzzling the Chavetz Chaim over here is, what do you mean v'hu hadin? The Ramah is coming off of the halacha that he just said, that you're allowed to grind cheese on Yom Tov using the moirig charetz. And over there he said, you have to use a shinui. Why? Because he said, b'derech klal, shredded cheese, there's no cost to Yom Tov if you would have done it before Yom Tov. So you should have done it before Yom Tov. You want to do it on Yom Tov, you're allowed to do it, but you need a shinui. Now he says, hu hadin, the same halacha applies that you're allowed to grind the matzah with a shinui. So what do you mean hu hadin? It's not the same. Gvina, cheese, you have to do with a shinui. Matzah, you're allowed to do even without a shinui. That's what's bothering the Chavetz Chaim here in Ois Katan Chaf. And the Chavetz Chaim explains, Ritzayna Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say is, the hu hadin matzos, the mutter lichtosh bekli hamayuchad, the same halacha as cheese applies to matzah. You're allowed to shred cheese using a moirig charetz. So you're allowed to shred cheese using the keli that is made for the shredding of cheese. Not like peppercorns and mustard. Peppercorns and mustard, you're not allowed to do it with the rechaim shalahem, with a pepper mill. But cheese, you're allowed to do it with the moirig charetz. So too matzah, you're also allowed to grind up matzah using the specific type of keli that's used for the grinding of matzah. K'moshe nagu, the way we're noig to do it, v'litchai noisam al moirig. You're allowed to use this moirig charetz to grind up matzah. Achein, however, bazeh, when it comes to grinding up matzah, kil yoser, it's even more lenient than the grinding up of cheese. The mutter afilu b'lo shinui klal. By cheese, you need a shinui. By matzah, you do not use a shinui. Why? Mishum de'ein tchina acher tchina. Because matzah is something that was made out of ingredients that were already ground. How do you make matzah? Out of flour. What's flour? Flour is ground up chitim, ground up wheat. So it's made out of wheat that was already ground, and now it was formed into a mass through lisha, through kneading it into a dough. Now you want to break it up again. You're breaking up something that was already previously ground, and that's mutter. Now we're going to break over here in the Mishnah Berurah for a moment and go back up to the Ramah. So the Ramah said, "V'hu adin matzos." So too matzos you're allowed to grind using a special keli. But over here by matzah, there's another kula that below shinui. You're allowed to do it even without a shinui. Not like cheese where you need a shinui. And why? Explains the Ramah, because there's no tchina achar tchina. Since this is something that was already ground, you're allowed to grind it now too. Now let's go back into the Mishnah Berurah is cut and chaf, a few lines into the Mishnah Berurah. Ula achar hatchina. If you did grind up matzah into matzah meal, after the grinding, nachain, it is proper lizar to take care. Shalo yivrar perure matzah shalo nichtishu adayin heitev mitaycha kemach. You should not. Sometimes you grind up the matzah meal like that. There are some big pieces. The Mishnah Berurah is warning you, even though you're allowed to grind the matzah into matzah meal, after you do grind it, you're not allowed to pick out the big pieces. Af biyad, even if you do it by hand. We know that one of the tanoim, one of the conditions for the malach of Berurah to be mutter is you have to do it biyad. You have to do it with your hand, not with a keli. But over here, you're not allowed to be Berurah. You're not allowed to pick out the big pieces of matzah, even if you do it by hand. Why? Because this is like taking the watermelon seeds out of the watermelon. which is also on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, even if you do it with your hand. Why? Because you're taking psoilus mitoich eichel. You're taking the bad thing out of the good. Well, the only time Berurah is mutter is when you take the good out of the bad. Over here, you're taking the bad out of the good. Even though the bad, the large pieces of matzah, are not really bad, they're eminently edible, but still, in the context of this taruvus, in the context of this mixture, where you have large pieces of matzah in your matzah meal, the large pieces of matzah constitute psoilus. You don't want them there because you can't make knedlich out of them. So you don't want them there. So that's psoilus. The also gam b'yontiv l'chadman the Omar, according to one opinion, this type of Berurah is also a yontiv. U'kamoishe yispar l'kaban siman tov kovav sif beis b'hagah. V'im yirtza l'kacham, if you're desperate because you want to make knedlich and you got to get these big pieces out, so the Mishnah Berurah gives you an eitzah. Yikachem im ma'at kemach. Take out the big piece of unground matzah with some of the matzah meal. The lekach shosha de Berurah. So now there's no isser of Berurah because you're not taking the psoilus out of the eichel. You're taking a mixture out. You're taking psoilus and eichel together at the same time out of the mix, which is mutter. U'kamoishe nisbar b'lchas Shabbos siman shin yud tes Mishnah Berurah siv katan samach aleph va'ayin bir halacha. And now finally we come to siv dalid, which will conclude siman taf kuf dalid. Says the Mechaber, Mutter Adam Limdoid Tfalin Litain Bakdera. You're allowed to measure out spices to add to your pot, to your cooking on Yom Tov. Bishvil Shalo Yakdiach Tavshiloi, if you're doing this so that your dish should not burn. Pirush, the Ramah says, what does this mean? Shalo Yisrafenu, because sometimes if you add too much dry spices to the dish, that will catch and it will burn your dish. It will become ruined because you have too much spices. And therefore you want to measure to know that you're adding the correct amount of spices. Now we know that medida, measuring, is something that's also on Yom Tov, even l'tzarech achal nefesh usually, because of uvda dechayil, not necessarily because of the malacha of medida. That's also a big machlokes whether or not there is an av malacha of medida, of measuring or not. But in any case, it's definitely also because of uvda dechayil. It looks like you're engaging in a large-scale baking or cooking operation, and that's an uvda dechayil, which would be aser. Nevertheless, to prevent your Yom Tov dish from getting ruined, we allow it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Chav Aleph, limdoi tfalin, you're allowed to measure out spices. Avagav de kemach also limdoi, even though we're going to say that you're not allowed to measure out flour on Yom Tov. Ukid l'kaman reish siman tov kovav, like we're going to see shortly in siman tov kovav. Hacha, over here in this case, she'agdiach tavshiloi, where there's a risk that your cooked dish will become ruined, will become burned. Hitiru, then the Chazal will matter you to do this. Uchid Messiah, and just like the Mechaber himself says that the reason for this heter is b'shvil shalayakdiach tavshiloi. As Katan Chav Beis, the Yasid kishiyiten tavlin yoisemidai. Your whole dish will become ruined if you add too much spices. If you always do your spicing without measuring, right? Go ask my mother. My mother, she should be well. Go ask my mother for a recipe. She's going to tell you a handful of salt. She's going to tell you a little bit in the palm of your hand of black pepper. She's not going to tell you teaspoons and tablespoons. So if the way you cook is that you never measure things out, then also lo limdoi b'Yom Tov. Then it's also to do it on Yom Tov also. If you never do it even during the week, don't come to me and ask me to be matter for you to do it on Yom Tov. This concludes Siman Tov Kov Daled. Baruch Hashem, we were able to cover yesterday's share and today's as well. Hopefully, I'm going to try to do a share tomorrow, which I think would bring us back to the Dirshu schedule. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should stand ganz Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa. The Rebbeinu Shalom should be Megan and ganz Klal Yisrael. Sai here, Sai in Eretz Yisrael, Sai wherever they may be in the world, anywhere in the world. The Rebbeinu Shalom has his eyes on them, and the Rebbeinu Shalom should protect them. Everybody, if I don't speak to you again before Shabbos, have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos. Be well.